So my name is Michael Whittle. I'm the curator and also one of the artists of this exhibition, which is called A Cabinet of Curiosities. I've been working on this project for about 2 years now, and it's a collection of over 40 artists and scientists' work, many of them collaborations, and we've decided to model the exhibition on a Cabinet of Curiosities. This is a very interesting style of exhibition because it mixes, it's in between medieval Christian collections, where you'd go into the basement of a church and pay a ticket to see the bones of a finger of a saint or a piece of skull. And these would have what were believed to be healing powers or magic properties. It's between that period and Renaissance cabinets, Renaissance museums as we know them today. So it's a curious mixture of the spiritual and the magical, but also the kind of logical and rigorous system of classification that we'd expect from a modern museum. The piece at the start of the exhibition that you see as you enter the building is a painting on animal hide by Professor Robert Platt. Robert's based in Kyushu in Japan, and he's interested in modern day camouflage, what 21st century techno camouflage might look like. He was explaining as part of his research as a professor of art is on a kind of art known as apotropaic art. This is a subject I'd never heard of before, but apotropaic art's found in all different cultures from all different periods, and it's made by people to protect against evil spirits and bad luck. We wanted to make a piece at the entrance to the show that would protect the exhibition in a way, but base it on 21st century science. So if we go round to the back of the animal hide, we've worked with a quantum physicist to design one of the most complicated diagrams from physics in the 21st century. James Sylvester Gates invented the adinkra and named it after a piece of African art called the adinkra. These are from the east of Africa, and people would put markings onto ceramics or paintings, and the markings would contain within them information that they'd pass on to the next generation about where to find water, ethical advice, hunting advice, things like that. So James Sylvester Gates named his project after that because embedded in with this enormous graph is a higher dimensional study containing hundreds of thousands of equations within this object. So Robert Platt was explaining in old mosques, you'd very often find ceramic tiles at the entrance to the mosque with the most complicated geometric designs painted onto them. The idea being that evil spirits trying to enter the mosque would become mesmerized and stuck looking at the geometry and not be able to enter into the holy place. So we wanted to make a very, very complex 21st century physics diagram to protect the exhibition. And that's the very first piece you see as you enter the show. Also at the beginning of the exhibition, I wanted to position this work. It's an early drawing by myself. It's ink and watercolor on paper. They're two diagrams from very different subjects. The lower part is from biology. It's actually a design by Kaoru Sugimura, whose background is in physics and mathematics. And when she went into biology, she had a completely different way of looking at the structures to a normal biologist. She grows these brain cells in the computer in what's called in silico, so in silicon, as in the silicon chip. And she changes the algorithm so that they grow within the 3D space, the virtual space, until the ends of the neurons almost touch. So none of your brain cells are actually touching. And the little gap between the ends of the brain cells are where the electrical currents flow, the kind of neurotransmission of the neuroreceptors. So this is a human brain modeling the human brain at the cellular level in silica or in a computer. Completely different scale and subject. The piece at the top is by one of my favorite physicists. He's a professor at Princeton University called Richard James Gott III. And this is his model, along with a Chinese mathematician, for the origins of the universe itself. So this is the human brain modeling the origins of something that made the human brain itself. He's designed mathematically a closed circle of space-time, Einstein's space-time, without a beginning. it looks almost like a cornucopia, these trumpet-like structures that are actually parallel universes branching out infinitely into the multiverse, which is a very popular idea in quantum physics today. It might not be the right model, but mathematically this is how our universe could have started without actually having a beginning. So this little engine is just making universe after universe which branch out, and we would be in one of those infinite number of branches. Another way that we've worked to make the works in the exhibition is to commission artists and a scientist to work together. So if you follow me through to the next part of the show, we've got these two paintings on velvet by a Korean artist called Sang-Sun. She's been based in Kyoto for over 20 years now, and velvet is a kind of light trap material. It's one of the darkest fabrics that we have. So photons go into the surface of velvet and get lost amongst the fabric itself. So it gives the painting great depth. I always thought her paintings looked remarkably like a scientist friend of mine's work, Minato Taketoshi, who's an expert in super high resolution microscopy. The kind of microscope is called a scanning tunneling electron microscope. And you can imagine it almost like a record player for atoms or molecules. So the work that he was producing and the images he was making with the microscope looked remarkably like her work. And so I introduced them to each other. And Sang-Sun visited his laboratory, and then he visited her studio with his PhD students. And they had a kind of long-term collaborative exchange of ideas, and that resulted in this pair of paintings, and then a couple more examples that we have on the floors upstairs. I've put these two paintings next to a pair of images which are very different in their origin. This is from a collaborative studio that I launched with my colleague Attica Sims from Seika University in Japan. It's called Studio Pollen, and we're using very early AI models to generate creative artistic projects. So actually hidden within these images are the Chinese character for xie, as in xie or thank you. We trained the model on orchid species, hundreds and hundreds of orchid species, and then asked the computer to generate new species between the ones that exist. So these orchids could exist, but don't. And I was very interested in the idea of using AI to search the space of all possible images, and in this case, images that look like orchids and contain the structure of the Chinese character. We worked with a local ink artist who painted the Chinese character for xie in lots of different styles from lots of different periods, and then worked with the AI to see which one was most successful in generating an image that wasn't exactly obvious, but once you know what's in there, you can't unsee it. That was also the goal for a series of 8 works on the wall behind you over here, using the same orchid model, but a very different template. We were asked to show a series of new images for an exhibition in Mexico. And so my collaborator Atticus and I were trying to think what images would be best to put in and what not to send to Mexico. So we both agreed that the skull and the skeleton and that kind of festival of death is too cliche to show at the exhibition. But after thinking about it a little more, we decided to try and sneak an orchid skull into the exhibition by disguising it with this pattern. So again, once you see that there's the skull in there and you see the top of the cranium and the jawbone and the eye sockets, it's very difficult to unsee. It was a remarkable project because certain images almost had a kind of medieval aesthetic, and some of them had very alien orchid species that are like nothing we really see in nature itself. I think the next piece I'd like to talk about is the tabletop piece that looks like a work in progress, and it kind of is. It's an ongoing project that we've made as a proposal almost for another commission. The project started when I read this wonderful paper published by Lord Kelvin. So most people have heard of the temperature scale Celsius or Fahrenheit, but scientists normally use Kelvin because it's an absolute scale. So 0 Kelvin is as cold as you can go, and it's actually physically impossible to reach. Kelvin at the time was the president of the Royal Society of Scientists in England, which is the most prestigious and long-running society for science in the world. He wrote this as one of many papers that he did during his time, and it was kind of just lost in the quantity of publications that he was making. I found this and read it. I was actually researching another project on knots that Kelvin had worked on as a model for atomic structure. And there's one sentence in the paper that really caught my attention and made me think it was almost like a message in a bottle that Kelvin had put in here for someone in the future to make this idea. He writes, "It would be easy, but not worth the trouble, to cut out a large number of pieces of brass in the shapes shown in these diagrams and to show them fitted together like the pieces of a dissected map." So he didn't actually make it, and as far as I know, these are his only 3 ever designs or artworks that he came up with. And so about 130 years later, we decided to follow his instructions and found that it was actually slightly more difficult than he anticipated, but definitely worth the trouble to make. They're based on hexagons. You can see there's a 6-sided structure, and then whenever you move one piece out, you have to make its negative form in the structure, and then these lock together in a repeating pattern. They're called a homogeneous tile, so it's the same piece that just tiles the plane to infinity. It's interesting that Professor Sugimura's brain cells, she also used this word tile. So I think Lord Kelvin's project did have a big influence on biology and mathematics, especially in cellular structure, because he started designing these into 3 dimensions. And so then suddenly it does become interested in for biologists. This is a silk scarf that we worked with Kaoru Sugimura to design, and she calls this a neuronal tiling pattern in the way that the cells fit together into a replicating design. So this is actually the same image that was used to make the watercolor painting on the back wall here, and you can see the individual cells and the nucleus replicated in the silk scarf too. So this is a series of 6 glass bells from Japan. They're called furin. Originally, they would have had their origins in Chinese esoteric bells that were hung in bamboo groves, and then people would listen to the sound of the bells to predict the future. They then developed into Buddhist bells, which are hung on the corners and inside temples. And when they rung, the idea was that the bell would send out ripples of enlightenment and good luck and health into the local community. Today in Japan, people hang these outside their window on hot summer's days, and they predate air conditioning. So the idea was the sound would make you feel cool at night. I've always loved these, and normally in Japan, you would have a little haiku or a Buddhist sutra or prayer hanging on the piece of paper or wood underneath the bell. So for this project, we wanted to find a way to work with 21st century science and have that suspended underneath each glass bell. The 5 darker bells are the 5 what's called Lagrangians, the 5 equations of the standard model of particle physics. It's our most highly tested, highly successful model that we have in physics today that describes all of the forces, the carriers and waves. And then the one light-colored bell, which doesn't fit into the standard model yet, is Einstein's field equation for gravity. It's a much weaker bell, so I decided to use a slightly more subtle color. And one of the big unfinished problems in physics at the moment is to connect all of this together, to find the graviton, or to find the way to mathematically incorporate gravity into the rest of quantum physics. So in this space, there's a wide variety of works from all different kinds of artists working in different mediums with different ideas. The piece on the period Chinese table here are a series of ceramics by wonderful Japanese artists called Yuko Fukada Thompson. And It's quite a tragic story, but in her family, Alzheimer's seems to run down the female line. Her grandmother suffered, and her mother suffered from the condition. And so in the back of the artist's mind, there's always that concern that genetically she has a prevalence for Alzheimer's also. And I think that was the origin for the story behind this project, where she would travel to places that were important to her in her childhood, such as a park in Tokyo where her father used to take her as a little girl, and find a stone that might have been there from that period. So she went to lots of different locations in different countries that were important or relevant to her personal history. She then took these stones to her studio and wrapped them in multiple layers of very thin colored clay. And then once these were fired in the oven, the stone inside expanded and burst through its shell. So you have this kind of ruptured or fractured surface to each of the ceramics. The next piece on the wall over here is our first ever view of the back of the moon. So the moon is actually in what's called a tidal lock with planet Earth. So as it goes around planet Earth, we only ever see one side of its surface. And for most of history, nobody knew what was on the far side or the dark side of the moon. And this was one of our first ever glimpses. It was taken by a Russian space probe called Luna 3 in 1959. They launched the probe and it managed to go around the back of the moon and take 40 photographs of the moon's surface. This is plate number 28. You can see it in reverse here. So this is pre-digital technology. And the probe was basically a photographic development system. So the camera would take the photograph, develop the negative, dry the negative, and then scan it using very early scanning technology, line by line across the negative. So it's actually a 1,000-line resolution image. 17 of the images made it back to Earth out of over 40. And of those, one of them was plate 28. The process of scanning the negative line by line reminded me of the artist Katsu Yuasa, who is a professional mokuhanga artist or Japanese woodcut artist. So he uses very fine tools to carve the surface of a wooden sheet, almost like you're cutting the grooves of a record. So the harder he presses, the more wood comes out, and the lighter the final print will be. So he went back and forwards across the surface of the wood, very much like the scientific process from 1959. And this is an addition of 5 prints that he then made on handmade Japanese paper. The cabinet behind me, with the noise coming from the door, the sound is actually from mission control in NASA in the United States. This was a project by my PhD supervisor, Shuro Matsui, where he was asked to propose a project for the NASA astronauts on board the International Space Station to take part in. He asked them to take a small glass bottle up into space and to open the bottle so that the air escaped into the vacuum, and then to reseal the bottle, put the glass bottle inside the metal container here, the protective container, and then bring that back down to Earth, where it would be shown on public display. Shannon Walker, on board the International Space Station, presented the bottle. I'll just show you a quick clip. So Shannon is one of the most important female astronauts at the moment in NASA, and she's shortlisted to go to the moon.
I, Shannon Walker, on the 14th of September in the year 2010, hereby announce that on behalf of the people of planet Earth, we will perform an EVA to fill this bottle with a bit of outer space. We will then take this bottle back home, where it will serve as a memento of our endeavors and as a message of wonder for all people.
So I really like that she used the word wonder in the conversation, because in German, the Cabinet of Curiosities Wunderkammer, or Kammer of Wunder. So when my professor first proposed this project, JAXA, which is the Japanese Space Authority, and NASA thought that it was such a waste of money and probably one of the most expensive art projects ever to literally collect nothing from space. But the astronauts loved the project so much, and people like Shannon Walker pushed for the administrators to go ahead and support the project. You can hear the voices from ground control as they're reminding the astronauts to go outside the International Space Station on an extravehicular activity. I think they'd been out there for 6 hours, and their last job that they did was to collect the vacuum of space in the bottle. To remind them to do the project, they played Message in a Bottle by the rock group The Police in the astronauts' headset. And so they started moving all around the outside of the International Space Station to find a good place to take a selfie and to open the bottle. Unfortunately, the tether attached to the protective container was a little too long, and my professor could see it bouncing off pieces of the International Space Station outside, and the glass actually broke. And so when they got it down to Earth, it was cracked, and the vacuum had been lost. Again, the astronauts loved the project so much that they put pressure on NASA and JAXA to do it a second time. And this time they took the humans out of the equation and didn't play music. And they had a robotic arm very carefully open the bottle in space, perform the function, and then it was safely returned to Earth. So Professor Matsui now travels around the globe with the bottle, performing Japanese tea ceremonies and spreading the idea that there is absolutely nothing just a few hundred kilometers in this direction. So let's go up to the second floor of the exhibition and look at the artworks that are installed there. Oh, of course, of course. So this is a second piece by Shiro Matsui. As an artist who's a professional sculptor, he's really interested in topology and the shapes and that strange boundary between the inside and the outside of a building or an object. This is part of a series of tabletop ceramic pieces. And if you look underneath the table, you'll see these two enormous ceramic spheres that contain water. And then inside the sculpture, you have the two little black goldfish swimming around. And they can disappear within this hidden space and then re-emerge and circulate around the table. Behind that on the wall is, I think, my favorite project from the Cabinet of Curiosities collection. It's actually a painting by the Hong Kong artist Hung Hoi, who's second-generation Chinese ink painter. His son Hung Fai has a piece on the third floor that we look at later, and they share a studio space together in Hong Kong and collaborate on projects together. For this project, Studio Pollen and Hung Hoi collaborated to send the artist to Mars virtually. So Hung Hoi hadn't really used VR before, and so we downloaded data from NASA's website, the very high-resolution 360-degree footage of the camera on board the rover exploring the terrain. I chose 4 different locations, and then we went to Hung Hoi's studio and put the VR headset on the artist's head and then showed him each of these 4 locations. I was very interested to hear the process that Hung Hoi normally works with, where he goes to the mountains in China and spends time there hiking, sometimes camping, and making notes and sketches. He then takes them back to his studio and creates these enormous panorama images on Chinese paper. So when he chose the piece, he talked almost like a geologist about the weathering process. And if you look very closely at the surface of the painting, you see the incredible fine detail he's put in of the ravines, the enormous crater here. And then the red coloration in the background, he's actually ground up a mineral that's very close to the material you'd find on Mars, iron oxide or rust, and used that to kind of create this impression of planet Mars. I think it's a historical painting because, as far as I know, it's the first time a Chinese artist has painted the mountains on another planet. The pieces on the wall behind me here that resemble butterflies are one of the most famous kind of diagrams in astrophysics. It's actually made of data, so each butterfly is 11 years worth of recordings. What they're recording are sunspots, these enormous dark, cool spots on the surface of the sun. The largest of the spots, which are shown in red, are around the size of planet Earth itself. And then you have the medium-sized spots shown in yellow, and the smaller spots shown in black. The data, if you were to look at the sun, is actually in this direction. So you can see this is what timeline here, and there'd be another year just here. So this is a period of maximum solar activity when the sun is at its most dangerous in terms of damaging the internet and electronic infrastructure on planet Earth. Then the white gaps between each butterfly are the period of solar minimum when the sun is very calm and there aren't any spots. The north pole of the sun would be here. The equator runs through the middle of the butterfly, and the south pole is down here. It's symmetrical because the spots are actually huge electromagnetic field lines that come out of the sun's surface and connect between the north and southern hemisphere. The data is stretched out because the sun is rotating in this direction, and of course at the equator it rotates faster, so it kind of drags out the data, and you end up with what physicists have called a butterfly diagram. So for the exhibition, we wanted to work with more senior established artists, but we also wanted to include some younger emerging artists in Hong Kong. We'd like to tour the exhibition to different countries eventually, and each time we visit the different country, commission artists and scientists from each country to work together on collaborations. This is a piece by the Hong Kong artist and also graduate of the Academy of Visual Arts, Amber Ng, and she worked with motion capture technologies in a children's playground to capture a kind of fragmented movement of the children playing on different equipment. So you have one of the series is called Monkey Bars. I think one is a child jumping into a sand pit, and another is based on a child playing on a roundabout. She then used the children's pen, which has different layers of rainbow ink in the barrel, and used a robotic plotting arm to plot out the data from the motion capture technology. And so it changes color in different parts of the image. So if we walk through to the next part of the exhibition, we have a wonderful series of hand drawings by Pongyu, Y. Pongyu, another local, very talented Hong Kong artist. This is from a very large series of drawings that he made called Moment of Truth. They're very abstract kind of landscapes when you look at them, but when you see the list of ingredients that have gone into each of the paintings, they suddenly become much more poignant and important. They're from all scales of reality, so from the cellular to the everyday to the astronomical in size. So some of them are supernova depictions, some of them are a bubble bursting in a mud pond, or a sketch by a caveman on a cave wall. Other pieces are from biology or molecular physics. So it covers the whole expanse of how we depict and understand reality. A piece in a much more abstract dimension is by the Australian mathematician and artist, Stuart Errol Anderson. So I joined a very kind of nerdy group on Facebook called Tiles and Tessellations, which has tens of thousands of members. And I always noticed that Stuart's postings were very aesthetic and much more ephemeral than most of the other artworks. I contacted him, and it turned out that he'd actually gone to art school in Sydney, which then I suddenly understood why the images were so beautiful. This is an algorithm that Stuart was working with, which packs circles together in different patterns. I think everyone's seen oranges packed in boxes at the supermarket, and there's a most efficient way to pack them like cannonballs, one on top of another. But as soon as you start to make the oranges different sizes, the mathematics gets exponentially more complicated. So for this piece, you have this very beautiful packing of circles. You can see they're all different sizes, from the very, very small to the fairly large. And then Stuart tweaks or allows the program to malfunction, and then chaos enters into the pattern. So you've got this beautiful contrast between the crystalline perfection of mathematics and then this kind of chaotic breakdown of the algorithmic structure. This is another piece that we designed with Stuart onto a silk scarf. The piece in the corner here is a collaboration between one of my former students at the Academy of Visual Arts, Myron, and his collaborative partner, Sylvester. It's a prototype for a work that I commissioned for this show, especially. They work in very different ways. So Sylvester uses very high precision 3D ceramic printing technology to build these 3D structures that he designs in the computer. Myron works with experimental glazes, which he chemically alters so that they grow like 3D crystal forms in the oven in a very unpredictable way, into, around, and sometimes through the precision 3D printed ceramics. And we'll look at the end results of the commission in the next room. So the final piece I wanted to talk about in this room is a piece that I worked on over a few months as part of a residency in South Korea. This is an island called Jeju Island, or Jeju-do, just off the coast of South Korea. It's a beautiful summer resort these days, but previously it had a very dark history. It's where people from the royal court in Seoul would be sent in exile. One of those people was Chusa Kim, who's one of South Korea's most celebrated calligraphic artists. So when he was sent there, it was a very barren rock. It's a huge volcanic island. This is a small drawing of the island from the side. And when you fly in by aeroplane to land on Jeju, you notice that Hallasan, the volcano in the center, almost looks like a pupil of an eye staring up into space. So I redrew the island to include the tear glands, which are at the top left and right of your eyes, and then the tear duct, which is the little hole in the corner of your eyes where the tears are drained out and go down the back of your throat. The little circular graphics here in red and blue actually represent the places where geologists from Seoul University placed very sensitive seismic machinery to measure any vibrations passing through the island. I think they were left there for almost a decade, and so the data would have included huge quakes like the one in Japan, which led to the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown. They then used this data to make very complex 3D scientific models to X-ray under the island of Jeju itself. So each of these units is about 10 kilometers, so you can see it goes almost 100 kilometers under the island, and you're left with these large sculptural, almost like a lava lamp structures of molten rock. Hallasan's currently dormant, but it's very interesting to see the kind of geological time frame of what lies under the mountain. The museum where I took part in the residency was the Chusa Kim Memorial Museum, and so this was a response to the island of Jeju. Chusa, in his walks around Jeju, is famous for painting the orchids which grow on the volcanic rocks. So orchids are famous for being resilient, and so for literati in Asia, they were a sign of the resilience of the spirit of a literati character. The fact that they would blossom on the volcano where other flowers wouldn't grow. So I noticed in Chusa's sketchbooks that he only painted the top half of the plant, and the roots were all missing, which is 50%. So I spent some time looking online and discovered this incredible project where scientists in China and also Dutch scientists had collaborated on one of the biggest orchid genetic projects to map out all of the DNA of every known orchid, which this is a family tree of bent around on itself. So you can see the mother of all orchids would be right in the center, and then that would branch out into different families, different species, and different genera. Underneath there's a kind of barren, waterless landscape that the orchid flowers have to deal with on the island of Jeju. So this is a scientific poetic response to Jeju Island, and this is a similar idea applied to the orchid flower itself. So as I mentioned before, Myron and Sylvester were commissioned to make 3 new projects for the exhibition, 2 of which are shown here, and the third is in a separate room. So you can see Sylvester's 3D printed a triangular fractal, a 3D fractal in 2 parts. And Myron's glaze is then applied, which then grows within the oven in very unpredictable ways, breaks pieces of the fractal and actually enters its structure. So it looks as though it's been dug up from some kind of mine. On this piece, you can see the flat bed of the ceramic printer. So it's actually been printed upside down. And interestingly, he's also incorporated what goes when a 3D printer goes wrong, and you end up almost with a pot noodle-like effect. The other prototype, which I originally saw, which led to the commission, is this beautiful hexagonal structure here. And you can see the glaze growing around the base of the 3D print. So let's head through to the back room now. So this is the third in the series of works by Sylvester and Myron, and we've positioned that next to another 3D printed ceramic piece by Shiromatsui. This is designed as a little goldfish bowl. The air is removed from the bowl so that water enters up into it to avoid a vacuum. And then the fish can then swim through into our space and then back down into its ceramic container. On the wall at the back here is a very early drawing that I made as a student. And I was woken up in the middle of the night by bird call. And in a kind of half awake, half a dream-like state, I started to wonder how the bird was making these beautiful sounds and what the anatomy might be like. So the next morning I Googled that and discovered that birds don't actually have a voice box. They have something called a syrinx, which is much more like a reed instrument. I also discovered that they don't have lungs like ours. They have lots of little air sacs attached to their 2 lungs.
So we have a 2-part breathing cycle where you breathe in and out. Birds actually have a
4-part breathing cycle. So the air goes into the lungs and then out into the sacs and then into the lungs again and then out. This allows them to fly at high altitude and also to sing while they fly. And so this is a kind of memory of that sound spreading out from a single bird on the exhalation. The drawing on the right is connected to that moment. So you have the bird and the bird call and the kind of spiral of the sound coming out from the syrinx of the bird. And then that's connected to a drawing I made in Japan. Scientists in Japan in the 80s had used early lasers to measure one of the largest bronze Buddhas in Todaiji in Nara. It's actually the Buddha of nothingness or emptiness. But the scientists made a topographic map of this 300-ton bronze structure. So it's a very nice kind of Buddhist contrast there between a 300-ton object representing the Buddha of absolute nothingness. And so I just connected those with very fine lines between the bird and the topographic map. Next to that is a piece that I made before commissioning Katsu to work on the photograph of the back of the moon. This is called the Mare Orientalis, which is the old classification system for naming parts of the moon. And the whole thing is the largest crater, impact crater on the moon. It's also one of the most recent, and it looks again like a huge eye staring out into space. The other small piece here is the most difficult pen drawing that I ever made. I think it took 5 or 6 attempts to get the lines right. And it was a celebration of one of the greatest discoveries. I think I was very lucky to be alive at the time when they proved that Einstein's theory of gravity and gravitational waves were correct. So this is a drawing of the two black holes which were spinning around each other faster and faster and faster. They then came together and formed a single enormous black hole object, but their weight was about 3 of our suns less. And all of that energy rippled out across space and time in the form of gravitational waves, which were detected on Earth during our lifetimes. So this is the kind of fabric of space and time and those two black holes rotating. And then just beneath that is one of my favorite pieces by one of my students, Ella Wong. At a distance, it looks like an abstract painting, but the title is Rocket Science. And if you look very closely on the top here, you can see Elon Musk's rocket taking off into space. So this then becomes the sky, this becomes a landscape, there's a little city, this becomes the rooftop of a building. I just thought it was a very quirky, humorous take. And she said that she came up with the idea, stood on her studio rooftop, listening to a podcast by Elon Musk. So this is one of the first pieces I collected for the current cabinet exhibition. Great, so let's go up to the 3rd floor and see the final installation. So we saw the painting downstairs of Mars by Hung Hoi. This is a beautiful early work by his son Hung Fai. It was actually his graduation piece from the Chinese University of Hong Kong in the painting department. It's a very complicated process behind making this image. He folds the paper up, which is already very wet, and then adds a single drop of ink to the top surface, which then penetrates right through the layer and repeats in each of the shapes. As he unfolds it and adds more ink, he kind of pushes the ink into different directions, which eventually lead to these crab-like structures. So this is almost the mirror image of the top version. The interesting thing for me is that Hung Fai talks about this like a biologist, and he talks about exploring the forms of all possible biological structures. In biology, that would be called biological design space. So the idea is all possible biological structures that could be created from DNA, theoretically. So as you can imagine, that is an almost infinitely large space in terms of design. And nature or evolution has plotted out various routes through that into the structures that we see around us today. The next piece I'd like to talk about is a piece that's often overlooked in the exhibition. It's a series of 2 sculptures, and they're by a local Hong Kong artist called Wing Po So. She grew up in a household where both her mother and father were Chinese medicine practitioners, so she had that kind of culture in her life from an early age. She'd found and scanned, 3D scanned, 2 rocks in Hong Kong, which she then had 3D printed in metal. These were then covered with chemicals so that they resembled the color of the surface of a real stone. Inside the metal structure is a heating plate. And then in the corner of the room here is a box that contains rainwater and a pump. The water is then pumped up a tube along the side of the door and across the bar at the top of the ceiling. And then a small nozzle drips single drops of rainwater onto the hot rock, which then explodes in a puff of steam on contact. I originally saw this as a huge installation in the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and the title of the exhibition was Fragrance, so artists were asked to respond to the idea of fragrance. And so Wing Po So decided to have that fragrance of rainwater from a village in Hong Kong evaporating into the space. Between the 2 sculptures is a very simple but very beautiful, almost a haiku-like 3D printed sculpture. It's by Professor Hong Tao Zhou of Macau University, so he's one of my colleagues. And it's a piece in Braille, so that people with sight disability or blindness can read and experience this artwork. The Braille dots, instead of all being the same height, are printed at different heights. And so they start to form these 2 hill-like structures with a valley between them. And then when you read the text, it actually describes what you're looking at. It says, this sculpture contains two hill-like forms with a valley running between them. So I thought it was very beautiful, very, very simple work. The next piece I'd like to talk about is a small fan. This is actually the beginning of a much bigger project. It's going to be a series of 21 fans. I discovered that on planet Mercury, all of the enormous impact craters left by meteorites are named after famous artists from planet Earth. Different choreographers, writers, sculptors, painters. 21 of those craters are named after famous Chinese painters and literati or poets. So for each fan, I've commissioned a Chinese ink artist to choose a crater after his historical Chinese character. And then they're invited to respond to that through an ink painting on the surface of the fan. So once we have all the 21 fans created, that'll be this collection complete. I mentioned the Korean artist before who lives in Japan and who works on velvet. This is another one of the paintings in the series that are a kind of artistic response to nature at its most highest resolution. So with this atomic scanning microscopy, you can zoom and zoom and zoom until you see the very surface of atoms and the energy fields that are created on the surface of reality. And finally, the last piece I'd like to introduce in this room is the carpet in the center of the space. It's actually a scientific experiment. So the whole carpet represents a test box, which is about 1 meter by 1 meter squared, and I've enlarged it for this artwork. The blue line, which enters and leaves at the bottom of the carpet here, is where a mouse or a rat ran into the test box and was there for, I think, almost an hour. The scientists sprinkled chocolate into the test box. The whole experiment was run in the dark. And the rat was wearing a special piece of equipment on its head that measured every time a brain cell deep in the very root of the brain, the oldest part of the brain, near the hippocampus, it's called the entorhinal cortex. The machine could measure the firing of a single brain cell there. And every time that cell was excited, it left a red dot on the diagram. So at first, the scientists saw that the red spots were clustered into areas and thought it must be an experimental mistake. So they redesigned it, they checked the computers, they checked the needle equipment. And after a while, they realized that they discovered a completely different kind of cell. They then drew the yellow lines through the center of the clusters and discovered a geometric grid, which was fascinating because it's the first time that we're seeing the brain or an organic system using geometry to function. They called it the grid cell, and together with their mentor, John O'Keefe, they were awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine. So George O'Keefe, who designed that needle equipment to measure the firing of a cell, had discovered a cell previously called the place cell, which only fires in the middle of a space. So his students then discovered the grid cell, and since then, people have discovered edge cells. So everyone in the room at the moment who's standing near the wall, your edge cells will be firing. And they've also discovered a door or a space cell. So if you're standing close to an entry or an exit, that cell starts firing. We also commissioned a contemporary dance performance and had them choreograph this wonderful performance on the grid cell carpet. The idea being that when the dancers are moving through space, those grid cells are firing in their brains at a microscopic level. So through in the kitchen,
we have a piece by the German architect and digital craftsman Tobias Klein, who's currently professor at City University in Hong Kong.
This is from a wonderful series that he made where he has these organic hand-blown glass-shaped structures. In this case, they're almost touching, but not quite. And they're separated by one of his kind of gorgeous 3D printed, algorithmically generated, almost chaotic high-resolution prints. So the first piece you see as you walk into the bedroom are the printed bed sheets. So these are actually a geological map from planet Venus. So as I mentioned before, Mercury has all of its geological features named after artists. Venus has all of its geological features named after historical women, some of which are mythological. You can see this black and white print opposite the bed sheet. This is actually the original photographic image that the astrogeologists worked from in developing this cutting-edge map of Venus. So each of these strips on the left-hand side here is one rotation, one orbit around Venus by a satellite. Scanning the surface, and the scientists then use Photoshop to piece all that together. So this kind of modernist striping pattern is actually missing data. This big circular corona or structure here on planet Venus is actually this brown pattern here, which almost looks like a coffee mug stain. And then you have these red lines, which I believe are dikes, where hot rock in the past has broken up to the surface of Venus through the structure. The piece in the corner ticking away here is by a Hong Kong artist, Sean Pak Hin Ting. It's a very curious mixture of time and magnetism. So Sean had removed the cover and then the hour, the minute, and the second hand of a cheap bedside clock, and very simply replaced it with a magnetic compass needle. It just sits on top of the rotating second hand, so that every second the needle gets knocked out of alignment, and just as it's realigning with the Earth's magnetic field, it gets knocked once again. So some of the needles go dormant for a few minutes or a few hours because they're just sitting on the surface. So there's a kind of chaotic element to the sculpture as well. And then finally, the dress hanging on the hanger at the door of the room. This is actually cleverly designed AI camouflage. So if you were to wear this dress in a public space, AI body counting technology would not be able to recognize you as a human. You can then tweak the algorithms to make the AI think that you're various other objects. So for example, a carrot or a camel or a snake. So it's using AI to fool AI by adding very carefully designed noise to a repeating pattern. So to our human eyes, this is a very bright neon pattern, but the AI system, you're kind of invisible hole in the center of a crowd. So it's a piece of petrified tree which is over 20 million years old. This particular trunk had a little split down the middle which we filled with clear resin. And again, because of that eye-like pattern, I wanted to put the tear gland at the top here, and then a simple chain which comes out the hole here, washes across the eye, and drains out of the tear duct at the left. So for most of history, the theory of vision is what was called extramission. So light was believed to travel out of the eye, bounce off objects, and return into the eye. And to us, that sounds like quite a ludicrous theory, but it wasn't until very recently that we realized photons from the sun were bouncing off objects and into the eye. So at the back of the sculpture, I positioned a candle, which when it's lit, light comes out of the slit in the front of the eye. So this is a silicone sculpture by a French artist living in Kyoto. He's one of those artists that when you talk to him, he's also making his mythology himself. So you never know whether it's myth or reality that he's talking about in his artistic process. It's actually created from silicone body parts. And he claims to have found a huge wooden case of these in Japan in a car park. opened the lid and found silicone t-shirts, arms, legs, and even sex toys. He took these back to his studio and cleaned them all and left them to dry. And then he built an enormous wooden pyramid in the center of his studio and put all of the silicone prosthetics and sex toys into the pyramid, and then poured the darker and lighter colored liquid silicone in and mixed it all up. He left it to set for a period of weeks and then removed the outside of the wooden pyramid. And he was left with this enormous kind of Egyptian-style silicone pyramid of flesh kind of sculpture. It almost looks like an MRI scan through the human body. And then, almost like a French charcuterie, he then used a knife to cut slices through the silicone pyramid structure. So this is the very top of the pyramid. He then opened it like a book, so you have this mirror image of itself. I think it mirrors very nicely the piece by Hung Fai in that biological mirroring, and we have a symmetry through our own human body as well. So this is the final table piece by Shiro Matsui, the Japanese artist. Again, he's used this kind of circular scientific piece of glass equipment and sucked the air out through a pump mechanism which draws the water up to fill the space. He then introduces aquatic life in the form of small fish, or in this case shrimps, and some oxygen-creating plants into the sculpture so that they can swim up into the room and observe us and then come back down into this very unusual design beneath. So this is actually based on Aztec patterns, these huge patterns on the surface of the land that the Aztecs created, which are visible from space or from the air.